On behalf of School of Gender and Development Studies and School of Law, I welcome to all of you. In this course, Understanding Gender and Law, in the Unit 1, there is a topic called Difference Between Sex and Gender. I divided this topic into two parts, and today I'm going to speak about part 1. Let me introduce myself, that I'm Dr. Smita Patil, faculty of School of Gender and Development Studies. Now, as we know that when one is studying, the women's and gender studies, and one is looking at the historical development, how this debate of the women's and gender studies emerge, the important topic which emerge again is the category of the sex. We know that number of literature and the number of studies way back done by the anthropologist, sociologist, and psychologist, and then eventually one would see that these debates also engages into women's studies by the radical feminists, particularly that how it has shaped eventually. So the objective of this lecture is to define the concept of sex and gender in relation to sex gender system. We will also try to understand the ways in which it has been described, the various gender roles and patterns existing in the society. As I already mentioned to you while studying feminism, feminist theory, women's studies, you must have came across certainly with these terms, sex and gender. And these categories which I am mentioning, sex and gender, it's very easy to distinguish between these two. For instance, sex refers to the biological differences between male and female bodies. On the other hand, gender refers to everything else that goes into making us quote unquote men and a quote unquote woman. And then eventually one would see that, this how it it evolves into social culture processes, economic and political structure. I want you that when you are studying this particularly this topic, please go around and see in your everyday life that how the category of the culture processes, social processes, economic and political structure impacts in fact the category of the sex and gender, and one would see that specifically in your everyday life. For instance, that girls going to the school, how the socialization process of the girls and boys happen from the childhood. Another important factor which one has to study when one is dealing with this category is the language. Now, language plays a very significant role in terms of locating the category of sex and gender. For instance, if we look at these binaries, sex and gender, you can see that this is existing only in an English language, and no other language, whether it might be a German, Tamil, French, Marathi, Hindi, Chinese, etc. These two terms are not something which is referring to the biological or social differences of two sexes. I must also say to you that initially this only category of sex was, formulated, and then eventually, as we progress the category of gender, it also evolved, right? So the distinction between the biology, quote unquote, and the social, quote unquote, have also been approached in much related ways. The most common pair of the terms to have been used is nature and culture. And I would, in fact, those who are interested, I would say to those students that have a look at this debate of nature and culture, which is extensively, in fact, debated by family scholars. The term sex has, of course, a long history of being used to refer to men and women, as I already mentioned to you. In the classical texts, for instance, Mary Wollstonecraft, she wrote a very important classical work, or the book which one would call A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she penned down in 1792. Let me also say to you that she was a liberal feminist, because it was a time she contributed, in fact, the 18th century, when the England, sort of transforming, and one would see that the semi-feudal feudal society was, shifting, the industrial revolution, these debates were emerging, and the liberals were talking about the rights, voting rights, right to education, and so on and so forth. So I would say that you can always go and look at this book, A Vindication of Rights of Women, which is easily available, in the internet, and you must read this book. So Wollstonecraft then used the notion of the sex in order to discuss and criticize the entire process that went into making a, woman different from men, which today we might call the process of social construction, right? So you could see that there is a shift, the 18th century, the ways in which she is, engaging with this. And today what we see is that how, we call it the socialization or social construction. So Wollstonecraft believed that women were brought up to be the weaker sex, unlike men, who were granted the capacity for the rational thought and political action. Or the famous work of the French feminist, I must also tell you that you must read this book, The Second Sex, which is written by Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist in the year 1949. And then the same book, was translated into English in 1955. This is something which, which makes you to actually think and rethink that, what are the questions these feminists are raising through these books. So which has then another classic, treatise, which, Second Sex, which I'm talking about, on the nature of women's operation in the society and history. So, in the history of the feminist thought, we have those who did not see any reason to make a distinction between biological sex and social gender, and use the term sex to make their arguments. The term gender has very much different history. It originates in grammar and linguistics, where it originally only referred to the use of different genders in particular language, and had no other, sort of connections or connotations. And I would in fact ask you again that in everyday discourse, when one observes who speaks what language, is the language is a, a gender biased language, or is the language is a gendering language? Because as a young generation today, they are very conscious about when they speak, uh, by using the category of the gender, and I see that that's a very positive move. So you can sort of do an experiment and observe in everyday life that how language and gender also plays a significant role. For instance, chair in Hindi, जिसको हम कुर्सी बोलते, has a feminine gender, and the sun in Hindi has a masculine gender, and so on. So different languages have a different patterns of gender in this way. English is not as strongly gendered in the way German or French or the other languages. And when one is looking at the Indian languages, among Indian languages, it would be interesting to look at their grammatical gender use, as there is considerable variation. It is therefore noteworthy that for the first time in the 1950s onwards, the certain American psychologist followed by sociologists use the term gender to indicate the gender identity of human beings. They made a sharp contrast between the biological notion of the male and female, such as gender differences, chromosomes, hormonal differences, and so on, and the ways we get our sense of who we are as a boys and girl, or men and women. Some of these, psychologists argued that it mattered very little while exact biological characteristics a particular body might have, which really mattered was how such a child was socialized by their family and by society more broadly. Let us now then move on to the next debate, which is within understanding difference between sex and gender, is the sex gender system. You know, sex gender system is a strong difference between the biological sex and social gender that were picked up by the feminists in the 1970s onwards. And those students who are interested, in fact, they must read the first wave feminism, the second wave feminism debates in order to understand, the significance of the first wave and second wave movement, which one would engage into this. Um, this gives a more clarity for your own understanding. So, one of the earliest formulation came from the famous essay by Rubin, which was written in 1974, in which she explained what she called the sex gender system. Now, Rubins began her analysis of women's operation by making some very possible claims. What are those claims? And she says, whatever we are, whether we are feminist or against feminist ideas, it is what we think the cause of the women's operation to be that will determine what kind of society we imagine to be possible in future. And thus, if we believe that men are innately aggressive and violent by nature, there would be a little scope for change other than to physically alter men's very nature or to get rid of them. But if we allow that much of the society and the economic relation within society are playing a role in women's operation, then a different and a more egalitarian future is possible by changing the social and economic structure. In Rubin's theory, then, the biological differences between men and women from a kind of backdrop for the gender system, whose basic structure she locates in theories of kinship, especially the exchange of the woman by men through the institution of marriage. And I think that it's very important to understand the institution of marriage. And this debate is very much, debated by the sociologists and also later on the feminist, the whole debate of endogamy, exogamy, and so on. So this is how the social system is imposed on the natural worlds, since it is men who do the exchanging, the giving of the woman, where men have the right that women do not. There are further differences between men and women, such as a division of labor, where by certain tasks are seen to belonging to the men and others to the woman. Now, Robbins goes on to discuss how the social system is imposed on natural differences, may even result in exclusive gender identities that suppress natural similarities. Thus, for then, any feminine, and I would quote, any feminine traits in men have to be suppressed, as well as masculine, again I quote, masculine traits in a woman. So you would see that in everyday life that sometimes some women are the ways in which they exercise the power and plays the power domination game in the society, in the offices, in the institution. That again is a gesture of masculine. And on the other hand, you would also see the feminine characteristics also. Rubin emphasizes how the sex gender system is not only about making sure that world is divided into two distinct groups of people, men and women, but also that proper socialization and development include compulsory heterosexual relation, preferably through marriage. So, this is to say that the proper woman must be married to a man. Therefore, a critical look at the sex gender system is not only necessary for those interested in promoting a society in which men and women will be equal, but is also meant to provide tools of analysis for gay and lesbian movements whose sexual orientation have been treated as a deviant and who are looking for the ways to critique the existing normative heterosexual structures in society. Let us now turn into the implication of our understanding of sex and gender on the many roles of the gender. Uh, and I think that I just wanted to tell you that look at cutting across that in 70s onwards, the LGBTQ movement, which has taken a shape, and even in India today, you would see that the ways in which that LGBTQ people celebrating and demanding the equality, even though the laws are there to be formulated to protect them, but still the question remains about the question of the discrimination, the equality, because law has granted us lot. So let's understand the gender roles. So that is to say then further, the proper woman must be married to the man, and you will see that this is something again a very very important intervention that uh, which one could see in the society. And you can observe that the distinction between a married and unmarried woman, a woman who gave a birth, a sort of exercising their reproductive rights, the woman by choice wants to remain single, or a single woman, or a single unmarried woman, and so on and so forth. Therefore, critical look at the sex gender system is not only necessary for those interested in prompting a society in which men and women would be equal, but is also meant to provide a tools of analysis for the gay and lesbian movements whose sexual orientation have been treated as deviant and who are looking for the ways to critique the existing normative heterosexual structure in the society. So let us now turn into implications of our understanding of this category of sex and gender on many roles of the gender. And for instance, in this category of sex and gender, the ways in which the boys and girls they grew up, how this category evolved and developed, and you would see that from the childhood the choices have been developed, choices have been given, how the social construction happened, how the gender roles played a significant role in this, which you could see that in your everyday life, and also the language. So let me conclude this lecture by stating that through this lecture my effort was to tell you this category of the sex and gender, how this category evolved historically and moved on, and what are the new, how it has taken contemporary shape, what kind of roles are there played, for instance, in the language or the linguistic, how this. How the question of sex and gender and this debate has been moved further um, from the feminist discourse, and today you would see that LGBTQ also talks about this whole um, you know mm, category of sex and gender in order to sort of make affirm the social the sexual orientation and so on and so forth. And you would see that what kind of gender roles are there when one is looking at the category of men and women, and then how the institution of marriage plays an important role in our everyday life. So thank you so much.